Hi guys, welcome to another video and I hope you enjoy what I have to say. We're moving on from an analysis of the natural history of morals and moving into a discussion about virtues. And at this point, we're not really talking about virtue, we're talking about pity. And I think pity is going to be a bridge to a discussion about virtue, okay? So here we go. In this section, we're going to explore different forms of pity and how they direct our creative drives or creative energies. So we need to name and define and interrelate key terms, which we always do. Then we need to outline two different types of pity, which are brought out by an analysis of how pity has been different over different historical periods, or maybe in this case it's not really a genealogy of pity. Maybe it's more about looking at the two different aspects of man and how pity differs according to what aspect of mankind you're considering. So it's not really a history of morality this time. It's more about two possible aspects of mankind. But if you know a lot about Nietzsche, you realize that the pity that he is sanctioning, or that he thinks is really good, is basically the pity of the master class. So, makes sense. We will discuss who should be pitied, who should actually receive pity and who shouldn't. Can you draw a picture of someone creating something? Because this idea of the creator is a really important concept when it comes to understanding pity. So first of all, score yourself on these three success criteria and then draw a person making something. Can you do that for me, please? Okay, what are the most important things to know about Nietzsche is he really believes, obviously, in the will to power, the will to actualize yourself through dominance over others. But he also believes in overcoming obstacles. And if you overcome obstacles, you get a greater sense of achievement, a greater sense of self, a greater understanding of who you are and how the world works, a greater appreciation of beauty, and lots of higher values and higher things. So suffering, according to him, is a necessary condition that enables us to be happy. Suffering and overcoming suffering is necessary for happiness. That's probably the first note to take. So then, after making this general assumption, Nietzsche questions any philosophy, and this is Callicles, because we were introduced to early Callicles, which reduces any form of value or what should be valued into simple binaries of pleasure and pain. But it's not just the philosophers, it's basically any modes of thought, any ways of thinking that reduces what we value into pleasure and pain. Okay, take a note. In fact, later on we find out he thinks these are pretty simple questions and there are much higher, more important questions to address in philosophy. And he says this because suffering for him is the forge, it's the creative place where we generate greatness. And once we achieve that greatness, once we overcome our sorrows and our identity, our self, becomes something much more complex and able and important, we achieve a kind of greatness. Suffering is the key to greatness and overcoming it. We don't dwell in it all the time. The point is to overcome it, but to understand that you embrace suffering and you challenge it and you fight it and then you move to another stage of greatness. Take a note. So then, basically, any of the free-spirited philosophers that he's always talking about, they kind of look down on any mode of thought or philosopher that wants to reduce value to questions of pleasure and pain, because it's not really embracing suffering as a creative force, a creative energy. Take a note. They do look down on these modes of thought, but they also have pity and disgust. They kind of look down and they disdain this way of thinking, but they also have pity for anyone who, chooses to divert their energies in that direction, because they just think that suffering can actually help you achieve things. So it's logically argued then that the pity that the free-spirited philosopher is feeling is not the same to Christian pity, which he would say is the pity of the herd. It's a herd mentality pity. You could imagine looking after the poor and the sick and feeling upset for the downtrodden or the oppressed. It's not the same. In fact, the pity that's felt by the free spirit is for, let's put it this way, the pity is for the fact that in society, the herd chooses to direct its energy in pity and into acts of pity, i.e., compassion, that diminish or reduce what mankind could be. So instead of trying to pour its creative energy and excellence into making great men and doing great things, you just spend your time and energy looking after the people who are dragging you down, you know. And he says this is a bit of a worry, this is a bit of a concern, because it's only going to serve to direct our creative energies into, diminishing ourselves and diminishing what mankind could be. So can you take a note? So a logical extension of this is because our energies are directed this way, we seek to create societies that completely obliviate or abolish any kind of suffering. We don't want suffering to be. And basically, we try and replace it with a situation where everybody's living well. Everybody is living well and is content. Take a note. Now, this kind of thought about like the project of humanity being abolishing suffering and replacing it with a general well-being absolutely terrifies Nietzsche, because it stops us from achieving or aspiring for greatness. It terrifies him like you wouldn't believe. And he also believes that if you do abolish all suffering, then you remove the engine that allows us to aspire to be greater. You need suffering. Suffering is needed in order to improve. Without suffering, one cannot be improved. But if the project of like the herd is to obliviate or kind of abolish suffering and replace it with well-being, there's no longer going to be that creative energy that will drive mankind to being the great mankind that it can be. Take a note. According to him, we are at one level a creature, but we also have the capacity to create. And the herd kind of diverts our creative energy back to the level of protecting the creature, protecting the herd animal. When really what's needed is basically that we should have the energy directed towards the creator. Because when the creator actually pours their energy into creation, they use their suffering to break themselves down and break others down and break things down, to reassemble it and to improve it, to modify it, to make it better. And because we go through this process of being broken down, reassembled, refined, improved, modified, made better, that's how mankind becomes great. But of course, suffering needs to be the initial step for the shattering. And then we go through the reassembling. That's how it works. And that's how we become, the Vitruvian man or the perfect man. I'm just using the Vitruvian man here as an example to represent what you call the Übermensch. Okay? Take some notes. So the pity of the free spirit is reserved not for the herd, but for the creator. Not for the creature, but for the creator. Okay? And philosophers must realize and rise above the need to reduce philosophy into a philosophy about pleasure and pain. Because if we do that, if we only get into if we only get into a binary logic like this, then what we're effectively going to do is we're going to miss out on all the greater questions of philosophy. And that would be terribly naive of philosophers. Can you take a note? So let's start reading and see what he has to say. Whether it be in hedonism, which is a philosophy of pleasure, or pessimism, which is a philosophy that everything sucks, or utilitarianism, which is basically we do the greatest good for the greatest majority, or eudaimonism, which is referring to the philosophy of Aristotle. All these modes of thought which assess the value of things according to pleasure and pain, that is to say, according to attendant and secondary phenomena, are foreground modes of thought and naiveties which one conscious of creations of creative powers and an artist's conscience will look down on with derision, though not without pity. So he's saying someone who understands how creative things work will look down on any philosophical system which tries to evaluate everything in terms of pleasure and pain. Okay, in eudaimonia, even though we looked at Aristotle and we kind of realized, oh, well, achieving eudaimonia means that we don't think about pleasure and pain as a consequence, but ultimately eudaimonia is a pleasurable, happy state, right? So he's trying to say that maybe eudaimonia is not necessarily a good thing either, though it's very different from what Callicles was proposing. in the sense that sometimes doing good can achieve eudaimonia even if it produces painful experiences, right? That's one thing that Aristotle would say. But obviously, he's saying the happiness is still a pleasurable outcome, right? So it's still something to reject because it goes against the creative forces in our society, okay? So we kind of look down on these philosophies, but not without pity. Pity for you. That, to be sure, is not pity for social distress or for society and its sick and unfortunate, for the vicious and broken from the start who lie all around us. Even less is it pity for the grumbling, oppressed, rebellious slave classes who aspire after domination. They call it freedom. Our pity is a more elevated, more far-sighted pity. We see how man is diminishing himself, how you are diminishing him. And there are times when we behold your pity with an indescribable anxiety, when we defend ourselves against this pity, when we find your seriousness more dangerous than any kind of frivolity. Now, frivolity means lightheartedness, and I think he's basically saying you being serious and going to this kind of herd-based pity or herd-based value system is something we find more serious, more dangerous than just being lighthearted. You want, if possible, and there is no matter of possible, to abolish suffering. And it really does seem that we would rather increase it and make it worse than it has ever been. Well-being, as you understand it, that is no goal. That seems to have an end, which is a state soon renders men ludicrous and contemptible, which makes it desirable that he should perish. So he's saying that mankind would kind of disappear as a as a being if we eliminated suffering, because obviously it's the engine that creates man and greater man. The discipline of suffering, of great suffering, do you not know that it is this discipline alone which has created every elevation of mankind hitherto or in the past? So what he's basically saying is that what creates the elevation of mankind is suffering. That tension of the soul and misfortune which cultivates its strength. So without actually having the suffering, we wouldn't build strength. It's terror at the sight of great destruction. It's inventiveness and bravery in undergoing, enduring, interpreting, exploiting misfortune. Whatever of depth, mystery, mask, spirit, cunning, and greatness has been bestowed upon it. Has it not been bestowed through suffering, through the discipline of great suffering? So suffering allows us to engage in all these behaviors that make us great. In man, creature and creator are united. In man there is matter, fragment, excess, clay, mud, madness, chaos. But in man there is also creator, sculptor, the hardness of a hammer, the divine spectator, and the seventh day. Do you understand this antithesis? So an antithesis is the opposite of the thing proposed before. Obviously the creator is the antithesis of the creature. And that your pity is for the creature in man, for that which has to be formed, broken, forged, torn, burned, annealed, refined, that which has to suffer and should suffer. So here he's kind of using the he's basically going on to argue that the process of rebuilding yourself after suffering and through suffering is what allows us to become greater. Okay? And that's kind of implied in that little rhetorical question. And our pity, do you not grasp whom our opposite pity is for, when it defends itself against your pity as the worst of all pampering and weakness? Pity against pity then, but no, repeat, there are higher problems that than the problems of pleasure and pain and pity, and every philosophy that treats only of them is a piece of naivety. So basically saying, if you give into pity and you base your philosophy on being compassionate because you don't want people to feel pain, you want them to feel pleasure instead, that's just going to create a naive, banal philosophy. All right, so what have we done? What have we said? We have looked at different terms. We've looked at pity and how it's been defined. And we've basically explored two different types of pity. There's the pity that the herd would feel versus the pity that the new philosophers or the free spirits would feel. And then, of course, we've got who should be pitied, and it should be the person. We should be pitying the fact that our creative energy is being poured into abolishing suffering, because in doing so, In doing so, when we do that, we remove the suffering engine, which elevates us to greatness. So the pity shouldn't be the pity that the herd animal feels. The pity should be the pity that we feel when that energy is being misdirected into something that'll just make us banal and mediocre. All right, so who should be pitied? I guess we all should be pitied, but we shouldn't pity the herd animal or the herd instinct. We should pity the fact that we're being reduced to the herd. Okay, time to take some notes, and thanks for listening.